of serial killer profiles for this countdown, but today was a serial killer that I had not ever heard of, so I was really excited to do the research on this case. Today, we will be talking about John Robinson. So back in 1984, Paula Godfrey had just graduated high school in Overland Park, Kansas. She was 19 years old, and like most kids just graduating high school, she was looking for a job. Her first kind of grown-up, full-time job. But back then, searching for a job wasn't as easy as just typing something into a search bar. Back in the 80s, people looked for jobs in the help wanted section of their local newspapers. Paula felt extremely lucky to be offered a position by a man named John Robinson. Before she could officially start, she had to attend this out-of-town training. So on August 23rd, 1984, John picks up Paula at her home so they can head to this training together. This was the last time anyone would ever see Paula Godfrey alive. Just 4 months later, in the same town of Overland Park, another woman has an encounter with John Robinson. Lisa Stassi is this 19-year-old single mother to a 5-month-old baby girl named Tiffany. She was really struggling to provide for her newborn. She didn't have much outside support, and she knew she needed a job. So she turned to this local outreach group hoping that they could help her get a job. And this was how she met John Robinson. John was so kind to Lisa. He offered to give her some money. He helped her find some temporary housing at a local motel called the Roadway Inn. So Lisa checks into the Roadway Inn on January 7th, 1985. She checks out just 3 days later with her baby in tow. Her stay at this hotel was paid for by John, who came to the motel to settle the bill, and then Lisa, along with little Tiffany, climbed into John's car at the motel before it pulled away. Lisa was never seen again. So now we're going to switch scenes a little bit and head over to Liberty, Missouri. This was a much smaller city than Overland Park, and there was a man named Stephen Hames who worked at the City of Liberty's small parole office. He became the very first investigator to look into John Robinson as a possible suspect. He wasn't looking into the missing women from Overland Park, though. He was actually looking into some concerns brought up by a local charity. This charity was called Birthright, and it helped women who found themselves unexpectedly pregnant with little to no support. According to their website, Birthright focuses on the mother, reminding her that there is hope and she is not alone. So John Robinson, a man who preyed on vulnerable women, becomes involved in this organization. So some of the people involved in Birthright had some concerns about John. So police goes to talk to him about these concerns. businessmen in the area were doing very well, and they wanted to give back to the community. So they had set up this program hoping to help young women with babies. Local business people giving back to the community is great, but Hames looked into John Robinson and noticed he had a prior arrest for embezzlement, and he knew he was probably dealing with a con man. He said, quote, "My initial thought here was, what's his angle? Who is he trying to con out of money, and how is he going to do it?" End quote. So to further his investigation, Hames calls other charitable organizations to see if anyone else had had dealings with John Robinson. He knew guys like this moved from one charity to another, not really ever changing their MO, just using the same cons. And it is during this investigation that he makes the connection between John Robinson and at least one of the missing women. Hames said, almost as an afterthought, that this girl was referred to him who had a baby, and this other charity basically said, look, we did not connect her with John Robinson, but another local organization did, and now she's missing. So then Lisa and Tiffany Stassi come up on Hames's radar. Hames calls the Overland Park Police Department, and this is where he learns that there is another missing woman with ties to Robinson. Her name is Paula Godfrey. The investigation was prompting more questions than answers. One of these girls had a baby, one of them didn't. Police were trying to find any connection between the two girls, and they're trying to figure out John Robinson's angle and who he is and what he's doing. So Hames contacts the FBI and requests their assistance in the investigation. With this request, an FBI agent was assigned to become part of the task force that is looking into Robinson. They search for any possible legal violations so they can put this man behind bars, even if it's only temporary. The search leads the investigators to a woman named Teresa Williams, who was pregnant. John Robinson had been placed in her apartment, and they were hoping to take Robin into custody for breaking the terms of his parole, because they had heard rumors that he had possession of a firearm, which was against his parole. So Steve Hames asks Teresa if she's ever seen John Robinson with a gun. They know she's been spending time with him. And she tells police that not only has she seen him with a gun, but that on one occasion he took out his revolver and put it into her vagina and threatened her, saying, "How would you like a blowout?" This was like his twisted humor, but this completely backfired because gun possession and the subsequent allegations of distributing illegal substances were enough to revoke his probation. Robinson then spent 2 years in prison, but in the spring of 1987, he was released and just able to wander around again. That same year, women again started going missing. Police knew there was a very good chance that Robinson was a serial killer, and soon another young woman went missing in the spring of 1987. Her name was Catherine Clambett, and she was last seen with Robinson after he offered her a job. Catherine was also the mother of a small child, although thankfully she had, the presence of mind to leave her child with her parents before she ran off with John and eventually came up missing. Police believed Robinson was responsible for the disappearances of more than just the 3 women and 1 infant. They said there were numerous females who had answered newspaper ads regarding opportunities to start a new life or jobs, and then they would just go missing. They were never seen again after answering these ads. Police knew that John Robinson was a predator, but the problem was they had no bodies. And with no bodies, it was hard to prove a crime had happened. So police have no evidence of murder, but Catherine joined all of the other missing persons cold cases that were piling up. So officers realize they have a very dangerous predator and they need to get him off the streets. And so they try to find anything they can charge him with to get him locked up and away from civilians. And they succeed. From 1987 to 1991, John Robinson was incarcerated in Kansas for multiple fraud convictions. When this sentence was over, he was then transferred to the Western Missouri Correctional Facilities, where he had to serve 3 more years for additional fraud and parole convictions. It was during this time in the Missouri prison that John Robinson met Beverly Bonner, the prison librarian. The 2 apparently had a connection, and in 1993, when John was paroled, Beverly Bonner divorced her doctor husband and moved to Kansas to work for John Robinson in a business venture that he had. So once they arrived in Kansas, John Robinson helped Beverly get a P.O. box so that her alimony checks could be forwarded to her. So her mother would forward these checks to her P.O. box for 4 years, even though after the initial setup, her mother never heard from Beverly again. In early 1994, Sheila Faith, who had just lost her husband to cancer the year before, met John Robinson in an online forum. She thought he was perfect. He told her everything she wanted to hear. Now Sheila had this 15-year-old daughter who was diagnosed with spina bifida and cerebral palsy, so she was unable to walk, and John had promised her that he would help take care of the daughter if she came and lived in Kansas. He would give her a job, they could ride his horses, and he promised to pay for her daughter to attend a private school where she would get better care. 45-year-old Sheila Faith and her 15-year-old daughter Debbie Faith moved from Colorado to Kansas to be with John Robinson. While the disability checks were forwarded to an address registered to John Robinson for 6 years, no one ever saw the mother and daughter after they arrived in Kansas. In the winter of 1995, John Robinson also moved to Olathe, Kansas, near where Paula and Lisa had gone missing 10 years earlier. Police were still trying John because he was a major threat to the community. But John had his due process rights. He couldn't just be locked up forever with no evidence, but they were watching him. By 1998, John had been using the internet to meet women. He met a 21-year-old Polish immigrant named Isabella Luka who lived in Indiana. He convinced her to move to Kansas so they could get married. They applied for a marriage license, but it was never picked up. John convinced Isabella to sign all of her bank accounts over to him, and then she told her parents that she had gotten married, although they never knew the name of the man she married. Isabella disappeared the summer of 1999, 2 decades after Paula Godfrey went missing. Police make a connection between all of these missing women and John Robinson. There was a family in Michigan and they called police to report their daughter missing. The woman's name was Suzanne Trouten and she was 28. Her family told police that she had moved to Kansas after meeting a man online who had offered her a really good job. The family was able to provide some correspondence between Suzette and this man. They also shared a photograph that they found that Suzette had, and this picture really cleared away any doubt that any of the officers may have had that John was involved in all of these disappearances, because without a doubt, it was a photo of John Robinson, the man they had been chasing for 20 years. Police concluded from Robinson's early behavior that Suzette was likely dead. It was immediately apparent to police that they needed to give this investigation all the attention they could. Suzette had last been seen at a hotel, so police were dispatched to this hotel, and they pulled CCTV footage where they see Robinson walking through the hotel lobby. So several different police departments come together to work on this case, and they have one big team of people trying to gather as much evidence on Robinson as they can. And this is when police find out that Suzette's mother and sister have both spoken to John Robinson. He told the family that Suzette had taken off on this year-long sailing trip with a rich lawyer. Her mother then tells police that she has John Robinson's cell phone number and she can call him. So, police ask her to call him and try to get him to say something incriminating or get any useful information at all. So, she calls and she asks if John has heard from Susie, and he's like, Susie, like he doesn't even know who she's talking about. And then he pauses and he's like, golly, no, not for like a month. And the mom's like, well, what did she say when you talked to her? And John says, who is this? And she's like, this is Suzette's mother. And he kind of laughs and he's like, oh, okay, well, from what I understand, they aren't coming back. They're just going to sail, from place to place until they've sailed around the whole world. And from what they told me, they're headed to New Zealand. And he's like, I don't think you should worry much. I'm sure when they hit the next location, she'll find a phone and call you. And so Suzette's mother says, if you hear anything, can you call me? And he's like, yep, I promise I will. Robinson didn't fall for the trap. He didn't incriminate himself at all during this call. And so then the surveillance team really amps up their surveillance trying to catch John Robinson. On March 29th, 2000, they are surveilling John. And they have like the 6-car team following him around. And on that day, in the early afternoon, he takes Route 169 into eastern Kansas. And police follow him, but they are getting lost. This is out in the middle of nowhere. Their cell phones don't have service. The police radios are failing. They're losing each other because they're trying to keep enough distance from John so that he doesn't suspect anything. So they're kind of just driving around blindly trying to locate each other. Robinson's destination was an 18-acre piece of land, and in the middle of this piece of land was a single trailer home. And this was the perfect hideaway for a serial killer. Police didn't want Robinson to know they were watching, so all they could do was quietly wait for him to leave. He stayed inside this mobile home for about an hour, and then he got back into his car and headed back the same way he had came. Police really wanted to get on the property to see if they could notice any obvious burial sites or find any bodies. But they needed some evidence, like they needed something to get a search warrant. In hopes to gather evidence for a warrant, they begin this practice that they call trashing. And trashing is going into someone's house and picking up their trash and then leaving other trash bags in its place so the person doesn't realize their trash is being taken. It's like not suspicious to them. So police are doing trashing at this trailer twice a week. But unfortunately, when they go through the trash, they find that Robinson has been shredding all of his personal documents. But they are so determined to catch this guy that they actually begin trying to reassemble some of these documents. And eventually, it works. They find out some information. Police find receipts to some storage lockers that were in John's name that were right across the state line in Missouri. They had no good physical evidence to convict John Robinson on any charges, but they really wanted to get a look inside these storage units. Everyone really wants to know what is inside, but the only way for investigators to find out would be if they had a search warrant. So they finally get a search warrant, but the grounds for this search warrant are kind of weird. So what happened was this woman comes forward and she says that she wants John Robinson arrested because he stole some of her favorite sex toys from her. So police are like, what is this guy doing? So from 8 to 5 every day, he would just be out and about. He would go to town, he would meet other women, he had some girlfriends that he kept up in different hotels. But then at 5 p.m. every day, he arrived home to his house where his wife was. They would have dinner. It looked like they were just a normal American couple. But police discover that Robinson is setting different women up in various hotels throughout the area. So they call one of these hotels that's called the Extended Stay. And they find out that John basically getting to know each other. And then there is some BDSM or like bondage, role-playing, sex happening. Police really couldn't tell at this time if there was a crime being committed or if this was just part of like the role play. They could hear screaming, they could hear slapping, and in a normal situation they would have broken down the door to make sure everything was okay, but they knew they had to hold off. They had to make a decision on how much screaming meant someone was in trouble versus how much of this was just this sex play. So the team decides to sit tight and they do not go busting down the door in fear that they would completely blow their cover over something that sounded pretty consensual. This would end up being the right choice. The woman ends up checking out of the hotel with no obvious signs of injury, but this would not be the last time that they would see her name, because later the woman named Vicky Neufeld would file a police report claiming he had stolen a bag of her favorite sex toys. Soon after this, another woman came forward to press charges against Robinson for assaulting her. So once these two women came forward, police finally had what they had been waiting for. Everything up to that point had been circumstantial, but once they had these people coming forward with accusations against him, it opened the door for police to get a search warrant. Two detectives, Greg Wilson and Jack Boyer, arrive at Robinson's house on Friday morning, and they tell him they are arresting him for assault and theft. They also tell him that there may be more charges to come, including murder charges. And he's like, "What are you talking about?" And they say, "Yeah, 5 counts of murder charges." And they began naming the missing women. And they said as soon as they began naming the names, the color just completely drained from his face. Police now had limited time to try and connect Robinson with all these missing women. So a forensic team goes in to search his home. They search for 4 hours and they find nothing. So they decide to go search this trailer in the middle of nowhere the following morning. So they start out early in the morning, and the plan was to go to this secluded trailer. They bring cadaver dogs in, and the morning comes and goes, but they still haven't found anything. They thought for sure there would be a burial site, like he had buried these women on all of these acres and acres of property, but they just couldn't find anything. The dogs weren't hitting on anything, and they all became very nervous. Everyone was worried that if there were not remains found at this location, they had no case. But then, around 1 p.m., one of the cadaver dogs hit behind this shed where several barrels were stacked. One of the first detectives moved a yellow barrel. It was kind of laying down, and they uprighted this barrel. And when they did that, they saw blood coming out of it. A strong odor then began wafting through the air, and they knew what this odor was. It was human decomposition. Then they opened the first barrel and confirmed their suspicions. There was a body inside, and they said the smell was horrendous. Once the seal was popped and this smell started to fill the air, they all kind of stepped back to knees were jammed up to their face. So they have these barrels full of human remains. The medical examiner goes about removing the remains from the barrels so he can do the autopsies. Both women in these barrels had been killed the same way, blunt force trauma to the head using what he believed to be a hammer. He tried to establish a time of death, but it was a little tricky. The autopsy took place in the year 2000, so one of the bodies was believed to be that of Suzette Troughton, and this was the last of his suspected victims. She had gone missing just 2 months prior. The second woman inside was actually the Polish immigrant Isabella, who had gone missing the summer of 1999. So police now still need to go search the storage lockers. So 3 days later, they do that and they find similar looking barrels. When they opened these, there were bodies in them, so they actually only opened one of the barrels and then left the other 2 for the medical examiner to open. But all 3 barrels did contain human remains. All women, all killed by blunt force trauma to the head. Police eventually ID'd them as Sheila Faith and her daughter Debbie and Beverly Bonner. The prison librarian John Robinson begins to attract a lot of media attention. He would end up being charged with 5 counts of murder. He refuses to speak to police and instead he sits in jail awaiting his trial. When his day in court finally came in 2002, he was convicted on all accounts and given a life sentence for Lisa's murder, and for the murders of Suzette and Isabella, he was sentenced to death. He went on to face charges in Missouri, a state that is more forceful about their death penalty, but police still had all of these missing women, and no indication they would ever be found unless Robinson cooperated with police. So a deal was made and he pled guilty and led investigators to the other women's bodies in exchange for his life, like they took the death penalty off. So he ended up getting 5 life sentences without parole. But there was one body that Robinson had not been able to lead detectives to, and that was of Lisa's 5-month-old daughter, Tiffany. The young girl had managed to avoid her mother's fate. She had not been murdered. She hadn't even been harmed. It was such a shock to police when they realized Tiffany was alive. 16 years after, they thought she had been murdered. So Robinson had actually taken the baby and given it to his brother and his wife and said this baby's mother killed herself, and basically they thought they were doing this like legit adoption. So they raised Tiffany, who was renamed Heather Robinson, and Heather Robinson knew the man who killed her mother as Uncle John. After learning that their granddaughter was still alive, the Stasi family requested to meet Heather, and her family was super upset because they were now worried that their daughter that they had had for 16 years was going to be taken away from them. But actually, when she turned 18, she was legally adopted by John's brother who had raised her. But her world was basically completely shattered when she learned that the man who she knew as Uncle Robinson. John Robinson is currently 77 years old and is still behind bars.